Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are going to be examining a variety of theories that attempt to explain why countries are at different stages of development. And we begin with Walt Rostow's model of modernization. It is a linear theory of development that developed countries go through a common pattern of structural change. There are 5 stages, and you will want to know these. Stage 1 is the traditional society. Stage 2 is the transitional stage, sometimes called preconditions to takeoff. Stage 3 is the takeoff. Stage 4 is the drive to maturity. And stage 5 is high mass consumption, sometimes just called the age of mass consumption. And it explains the development experience of Western countries and is a general model for many others. Rostow developed this theory in 1960, particularly because he was concerned with how the dozens of newly independent countries in Africa and Asia would survive economically. So, he looked at how the countries that were already economically powerful by the 1960s had gotten where they were. So simply stated, this theory is an attempt to explain the stages that a country goes through as it moves from lower levels of development to higher levels of development in a linear progression. As a result, you may sometimes hear this model referred to as a ladder of development. The visual in the bottom right kind of suggests that, right? Rungs on a ladder moving up. And a major underlying theme of Rostow's model is the impact of investment. He believed that investment was the stimulus that generated economic growth. And it was investment in various sectors of the economy that drove this progression. And this makes this theory a classical liberal model of development. Now, when we say liberal, we do not mean politically liberal, which is sometimes associated with the Democratic Party nowadays. But instead, we're talking about economic liberalism, which is based on a free market where private investors are able to invest in fields that they deem will generate a substantial return on their investment. This graphic is a nice visual that combines the sectors of the economy with the stages of Rostow's model. Let's look at each stage. In the traditional society, the dominant activity is subsistence farming. As countries move into stage 2, or preconditions for takeoff, there is greater diversification as private individuals invest in certain areas of the secondary sector. As those investments pay off and advancements emerge, countries move into stage 3, or the takeoff stage. And this is when the country experiences something like what we've talked about with an industrial revolution. It really begins to industrialize. And individuals begin to invest in a variety of other areas, which results in rapid growth of the secondary sector, while the primary sector declines and the tertiary sector begins to grow. Countries then start the drive to maturity, when technologies will diffuse, industrial specialization takes place, and international trade begins to expand. Demographically, in stage 4, we also notice that population growth begins to slow. Finally, countries will enter the age of mass consumption, when there are high incomes and widespread production of many goods and services. Most people can accumulate wealth to such a degree that they don't necessarily need to worry as much about their day-to-day subsistence needs. First and foremost, this slide is going to be a great review slide and goes into a lot of great detail for each stage of Rostow's model. I would encourage you right now to go ahead and pause the video and read through each of the characteristics of each stage. Now that you've read through the characteristics of each stage, let's provide 2 sets of examples. Since this model examines a single country's progression toward modernization, Let's look at when the United States was in each stage of Rostow's model. The US was in the traditional society stage prior to independence from Great Britain. We moved into preconditions to take off during the first half of the 1800s. The investments of stage 2 led to takeoff during the middle of the 1800s, and that was followed by the drive to maturity during the late 1800s and into the 1900s. Then the US entered the age of mass consumption during the first half of the 1900s and has remained in that stage ever since. Kind of think about the excesses of the Roaring Twenties and things like that, post-World War II, buying cars and homes and things like that. That's kind of what that age of mass consumption is. Now, let's also look at some other examples, current examples, of countries that are in each of the 5 stages. A country that's in the traditional society stage would be Afghanistan. A country that's in the pre-takeoff or preconditions to take off stage would be Nigeria. A country that is taking off would be Brazil. A country that is driving to maturity would be China. And a country that is in the age of mass consumption, Japan. As with most theories, there have been criticisms leveled at Rostow's model. The first is that there is a Western bias to this model, and that not every country had, can, or needs to develop the same way the United States and Europe did. It assumes that every country started in the same place and must take the same steps to reach the highest rung on this ladder of development. Therefore, critics argue, the model cannot be applied uniformly everywhere. The second criticism is that many other factors other than just investment can influence development. Things like war, colonialism, political differences, cultural differences, the rise of supranational organizations, the physical geography and climate of a country, as well as just outside influences from other countries, particularly more developed countries, can affect the route that countries take as they improve developmentally. Take, for example, one of those, the reality of cultural differences. Different cultures think, feel, and act differently. So, for example, many people may feel that political freedom or decent working conditions are more important than the mass consumption of material goods. The third criticism is that greater levels of development does not necessarily mean that countries must consume more. Many environmentalists actually argue that greater levels of development can actually lead to greater awareness of the dangers of mass consumption. And conversely, a poor country could quickly industrialize today through foreign investment, but it might not reap a lot of economic benefit from this, and it could experience severe environmental consequences. And that final point brings up perhaps the biggest criticism of Rostow's model today, and that is that this model suggests that countries proceed on this path to development in isolation from one another. Is a climb up the ladder truly dependent on what happens within one country? Or do we need to take into account all the other countries, their places on the ladder, and how their actions and global forces affect an individual country's movement up the ladder of development? The reality is that countries are very interdependent, and that this model examines each country as an independent entity in a very interconnected world. So is there a theory of development that does examine the interdependent nature of our global economy? And the answer to that question is yes. This is Wallerstein's world systems theory. Now, we've looked at this earlier this year in terms of classifying development, but now we're going to look at it as a model of how countries move and change and become more developed, or reasons why they're less developed. This is a dependency theory. Please make that note, a dependency model, which means that countries do not exist in isolation, but are part of an intertwined world system in which all countries are dependent on each other for different things. Dependency theory argues that development is better understood as a relational process rather than a series of stages. And in the case of Wallerstein's model, that process was linked to international trade. Now, unlike early dependency theorists who thought that the international system of trade was the cause of underdevelopment, Wallerstein argued that it was actually the capitalist world system that caused dependency and underdevelopment. Wallerstein believed that not all places could be equally wealthy in a capitalist world economy. Now, unlike Rostow, who suggested that every country would eventually reach the highest level of development, the world system theory will always include a combination of types of countries. Some countries would be the core, and others would be the periphery. And still more would occupy a middle ground called the semi-periphery. In short, the world systems theory incorporates space, we're talking about geography, time, it also incorporates history, as well as power relationships. So it looks at politics as well. Now, core regions are those where core processes are clustered. Core regions have also achieved high levels of prosperity and are dominant players in the world economy. Wallerstein showed that core states are militarily strong, share a highly skilled labor force, and possess a diversified economy that is based on a system of production that relies on high inputs of capital per person. Core countries include most quinary and quaternary sector workers, such as senior managers, research staffs of international corporations, transnational corporations. Historically, core countries achieved their initial dominance through the industrial production, which then led to political control through colonization. These made colonies dependent on the colonizers and brought wealth to those colonizers as well. Now, even after colonialism ends, the economic, political, and social networks created through colonialism persisted. Goods and capital continued to flow from colonies to their former colonizers. And this is known as neocolonialism, which is the entrenchment of the colonial order, such as trade and investment, under a new guise. So colonialism is done, but still wealth flows from former colonies to former colonizers. And under this system, the world major powers, the core, continue to control poorer countries like the periphery and semi-periphery, even though those poorer countries are now politically independent states. So neocolonialism relied more on economic and cultural control rather than direct political control. And this model can often be applied at different scales. For example, the core region of the United States would be the urban, high-income, and politically significant stretch from Boston to Washington, D.C. Now, in contrast, peripheral regions possess a less skilled labor force and a more labor-intensive system of production. Peripheral regions tend to be colonies rather than full-fledged states, or have a history as a colony. They're generally politically weak and usually lack diversified economies, as they often rely on the primary sector where workers are engaged in the extraction of raw materials, and often it might be a very limited number of raw materials. They specialize in one crop or one resource. But Wallerstein disagreed with Rostow and recognized that a country can produce agriculture using core processes and gain wealth, while another country could produce the very same agricultural product with peripheral processes and gain almost no wealth. So in other words, when we say core process, we're talking about capital intensive. So if you're a commercial farmer and you're using a lot of machines, that's a core process to harvest an agricultural product. So it's not just that they are farmers, it's how are they farming. And so in other words, generating wealth is not necessarily determined by what is produced. It depends on how it is produced. Therefore, peripheral regions are classified as periphery because they generate very little wealth for the people in that place. Now, Wallerstein's theory called for a core, a periphery, and a semi-periphery. The semi-periphery exhibits both core and peripheral processes, and semi-peripheral places serve as a buffer between the core and the periphery in the world economy. Countries of the semi-periphery exert more power than peripheral regions, but still remain heavily influenced by core regions. Semi-peripheral regions often have some capital-intensive manufacturing and some economic diversification. Semi-peripheral countries are often home to many workers in the secondary sector, such as factory workers, but also in the tertiary sector, such as call center staffs. They are likely to be peripheral regions that are now on the rise, or formerly core states that are in decline. The best example of that are our BRICS countries. Sometimes it's BRIC, other times it's BRICS. Make sure you know these five. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. All right? And we've got countries in a variety of different regions there, so there's a lot of good examples. These countries have and are demonstrating a shift in global economic power away from the traditional economic core. Now, a key component of this theory is that there is not a lot of opportunity for upward mobility by periphery countries. This theory assumes that there will always be a global periphery that will be dependent and exploited by the global core. But India is an example of a country that sought to avoid economic dependence, which is why our textbook talks about them through the self-sufficiency approach. India developed a wide variety of industries within their country, but now, as they have continued to evolve economically, they have a diversified and globally involved economy. Wallerstein's world system theory came under fire by some critics for its Marxist-influenced critique or criticism of capitalism. Our next theory of development is called neoliberalism. Neo means new, and liberalism is again talking about economic freedom, a free market economy. So neoliberalism derives from the neoclassical idea that government intervention into markets is inefficient and undesirable and should be resisted whenever possible. Neoliberalism is strongly anchored in the idea that capitalism could in fact drive improvements in development, which was contrary to what Wallerstein said, that it was the reason for underdevelopment. This system favors a free, unregulated market and the removal of barriers to the movement of goods, services, and capital. A major component, and one that you should absolutely associate with neoliberalism, are structural adjustment loans or structural adjustment programs. And these became the cornerstone of the neoliberal development model during the 1980s and 1990s. And they influenced the policies of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, as well as the World Bank in terms of loans. In order for developing countries to secure these loans, countries had to agree to adjust the structure, hence the name, They had to adjust the structure of their economy or their government through reforms, which might include privatizing government entities, opening the country to foreign trade, reducing tariffs or taxes on imports, and encouraging foreign direct investment. Structural adjustment programs help to curb the high rates of inflation and reduce the budget deficits in a number of countries. But some critics have argued that structural adjustment programs have adversely affected the poorest people. Two major components of structural adjustment programs were market reforms, like those that are listed on the left-hand side of the table, and deregulation, which basically means the removal of laws or restrictions that might hamper economic progress. You see those on the right. Structural adjustment programs focused on the development of exports. Thus, developing countries often fell back into a troublesome pattern of exporting just one or two agricultural and mineral commodities instead of diversifying their economies by branching out into several different sectors. Structural adjustment programs also called for reduced government spending and cuts to public services. So, there were cuts to areas like healthcare systems. And so those were the areas that were most negatively affected. And structural adjustment programs encouraged the removal of agricultural subsidies as another way of reducing government spending. Usually, the removal of subsidies raised the price of food, which was great for farmers, but the people who were most severely affected negatively were the poorest people who now struggled to be able to afford food. For some development experts, structural adjustment and neoliberalism were too narrowly focused on economic growth and did not give enough consideration to improvements in the quality of people's lives. So, since 1999, reducing poverty has been the focal point of present development theory. Now, poverty is a really complex, multifaceted problem. So reducing poverty requires a comprehensive approach, one that balances concern for economic growth with improvements in social as well as environmental well-being. Our next theory of development was established in 2000 with a deadline by 2015, and these were called the Millennium Development Goals. The goal was to improve the condition of the people in the countries with the lowest standards of human development. These peripheral countries struggle with high population growth rates, lack of education, foreign debt, autocratic or corrupt leadership, political instability, and widespread disease. The Millennium Development Goals sought to try and rectify many of these issues. There were 8 goals that included addressing hunger, gender inequality, education, health, and healthcare, as well as promoting sustainability and a more balanced and peaceful approach to development. By the time 2015 rolled around, the Millennium Development Goals had become the most successful anti-poverty program in history. Now let's look at one example of the improvements that were made under the Millennium Development Goals. In the year 2000, 83% of kids were enrolled in primary school. In just 15 years, that percentage rose to 91%, with corresponding improvements in literacy rates as well. So how exactly did we achieve this? One program called Bolsa Familia in Brazil began in the 1990s and expanded in 2003, and it pays family cash under the condition that their children enroll and attend school as well as receive medical checkups. 50 million Brazilians enrolled in Bolsa Familia and 36 million were brought out of extreme poverty as a result of this one program. Conventional development favors economic and social gains, but doesn't give much attention to the impact of these gains on resource use, consumption, or the state of the environment. And with mass consumption and increased population density, people place greater burdens on the environment. So, with that in mind, in 2015, a new set of goals were rolled out. They were called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The system of sustainable development is development that provides for the needs of the present generation without diminishing the options of future generations. It's also a name given to an emerging school of thought in the 1990s. That is an umbrella term, sustainable development, under which the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals fall. In other words, this system favors economic and social gains that are achieved in ways that do not compromise natural resources or the state of the environment for future generations. For example, if farmers grow crops in ways that cause extensive soil erosion, land that is fertile today may not be fertile in the future, and food supplies could decrease as a result. So the Sustainable Development Goals continue the work of the Millennium Development Goals in areas like eradicating poverty and ending hunger, in promoting healthcare as well as gender equality. But they also seek to improve green energy resources, reduce economic inequalities, and fight climate change. It also seeks to promote strong democratic institutions. But what does that mean? Well, countries of the core have established democracies and have held regularly scheduled democratic elections. But countries in the periphery and semi-periphery have had a much harder time establishing and maintaining democracies. In fact, many countries have alternated between quasi-democratic institutions as well as military governments. And so the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 seeks to promote stronger democratic institutions throughout the world. But poverty actually works against this goal. In Afghanistan, for example, economic problems represent one of the greatest threats to the stability of the US-supported government in Kabul. In fact, The Economist, which is a publication, claimed that, quote, poverty helps the Taliban, end quote. The Taliban, remember, are an extremist Muslim group that has controlled the government of Afghanistan in the past and still holds a lot of influence in parts of Afghanistan now. And The Economist believes that poverty actually helps the Taliban to maintain control rather than the democratic institutions in place that the US supports. At its heart, the Sustainable Development Goals follow in the same footsteps as the Millennium Development Goals by attempting to address poverty as a strategy for development. But there are other obstacles other than just poverty. Global dependence on fossil fuels is not sustainable and has created significant amounts of pollution, particularly in urban areas. The Environmental Sustainability Index has been devised as a measure to look at country by country the level of progress towards sustainability. So, is this Environmental Sustainability Index, which is shown here, a good indicator of development? Well, generally, yes. Countries with darker shades of green like France and Sweden are engaging in more environmentally sustainable practices. Those are core countries. Whereas countries like India and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are less sustainable. And so while, yes, this is generally a good indicator of development, there are a variety of variables to consider beyond just the level of development. These could include air and water quality, biodiversity, population pressures, the responsiveness of the private sector to movements towards sustainability, as well as the level of government intervention. Tourism is another challenge as well. To develop tourism, the host country must make substantial investments in infrastructure, including airports, cruise ports, roads, as well as communication systems like telephone, cellular, and internet. One effort to try and promote economic development in a sustainable way is through ecotourism. Tourism that attempts to protect local ecosystems and to educate visitors about them. Ecotourism is responsible travel that does not harm ecosystems or the well-being of local or indigenous people. For example, tourists who visit selected sites in Botswana's wildlife habitats, Australia's coral reefs, or Costa Rica's cloud forest might be charged a fee to fund the maintenance and protection of those selected sites. In fact, for Costa Rica, they have protected 25% of their land in the form of national parks and other protected areas. Now, another example of ecotourism is that tourist revenue is helping to rescue Uganda's mountain gorillas from extinction, especially now that the government has realized that the wildlife serves as a valuable tourist attraction. However, a focus on ecotourism still has to be managed and managed responsibly, because as national parks attract additional tourist revenue, the increased tourist numbers can also place a strain on the environments that are intended to be protected. Additional tourist revenue may also attract multinational corporations whose income often flows out of the country. Now, finally, we wrap up talking a little bit about microloans and microfinance. Non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are not run by states or local governments. Rather, they operate independently, and the term is often reserved for entities that operate as nonprofits. In recent years, NGOs such as the Grameen Bank, based in Bangladesh, have initiated microcredit or microfinance, microloan programs as another strategy that is associated with sustainable development. These programs provide small loans to start or expand a business, particularly to poor people and especially to women, who would not normally qualify for credit from traditional sources like larger banks. Microfinance often encourages the development of small businesses. And the repayment rate of these microloans is unusually high, more than 98%. But microfinance has been less successful in places with high mortality rates from diseases such as AIDS. If the borrower is unable to work or the family has medical or funeral costs, the borrower is more likely to default on that loan. So tonight, we covered a variety of different theories regarding changing levels of development, from Rostow's modernization model to Wallerstein's world system theory. We talked about neoliberalism and the most recent movement toward poverty reduction through the Millennium Development Goals and the most recent Sustainable Development Goals. That is where we leave off for tonight. Have a good evening, everyone, and I'll see you back in class.